Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to our school's annual Martin Luther King event, this year part of our Civic Discourse project in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. I'm William Anthony Hay, Associate Director for Public Programs and Professor in the school at Arizona State University. This is the Civic School at ASU. I'll add that good things come to those who wait. So we're on a leisurely Arizona start today. And we are very glad in commemorating the Martin Luther King Day holiday to have with us Wilfred Reilly. Our larger series, the Civic Discourse Project, is now in the 9th year. And we're very grateful to all of the support we've had from attendees at these events and donors and supporters and our team here in SCETL and at ASU. Our school's website has an archive of past events and webinars for the past seasons, including the whole series of lectures and dialogue events in the Civic Discourse Project and our annual conference. That can be found on our website, which is scetl, S-C-E-T-L, @asu.edu. Have to put that pitch in. And another pitch is for our upcoming annual conference. This year marks the semi-quincentennial of American independence, America 250. SCETL's annual conference next month is entitled American Independence and the World, the United States at 250. Our program covers not only the debates around the Declaration of Independence, how do you get from shots fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775 to claiming a place among the nations of the earth with the Declaration, and then how a candid world received that document and received that event, and then the struggle for independence. So we have a slate of presenters, including Jack Rakov from Stanford, David Armitage from Harvard, several specialists, Brendan Sims from Cambridge University. So please come and join us on the afternoon of Friday, February 27th, and all day Saturday, February 28th. For our program. More to follow on that. Now, when SCETL launched as a new department at ASU, the School for Civics, we established an annual lecture to honor Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and this national holiday. It provides an occasion to celebrate a great civic leader and statesman, the principles he advocated, and his abiding faith in Americans' founding principles. As he declared in his 1963, I Have a Dream address. And that's why we include that address in our pocket constitution. So today we're very glad and honored to have Wilfred Reilly as our speaker, a tenured professor of political science at the Kentucky State University, an historically black university in Kentucky. He earned a law degree from the University of Illinois before earning a doctorate in political science. He's the author of books including Taboo, the 10 facts you can't talk about, and the upcoming Confidentially Wrong. Much of Reilly's work examines the sacred cow theories of the American political left and the American political right, testing them against evidence to see whether they have a basis in fact. Who knew? Empirical evidence, fact, testing ideas against reality. Does the tendency to view politics and government and society in terms of groups stand up to that empirical test of fact, or should we just treat people as individuals? To answer that question today, of which path Americans should take, please join me in welcoming Wilfred Reilly.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Glad to be here. How are you guys? Good. All right, round of applause. Hopefully not the last one. All right, so I am Wilfred Reilly. I'm an associate professor of politics at Kentucky State University, and I am indeed the author of the books Taboo, Hate Crime Hoax, and Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And I appreciate the comment about my most recent upcoming book, Confidently Wrong, To give a brief description, Confidently Wrong is a completely nonpartisan book. It looks at something that I became curious about when I was working in the business, kind of sales and trading floor world years ago, which was why expert predictions, bluntly, especially academic expert predictions, were so bad that we didn't use them to make projections. This was at a time when we'd gone through about 10 potential world-ending apocalypses that never happened. Many of you guys are very young, so I don't know if you remember the population bomb. The good Dr. Ehrlich's claimed that the world was going to come to an end by, I believe, 1989. This was followed by peak oils 1 through, I think, 9. We were going to run out of resources. The Club of Rome, we were going to run out of resources and die. The Great Western Heterosexual AIDS epidemic, killer bees, and the Great Northerly Migration. These are all probably before your time. But anyway, we saw similar things when it came to the projections of the number of people that would die during the very real COVID-19 crisis, so on down the line. I actually became interested in this, why we often seem to focus on climate change, for example. Bill Gates recently came out and said, of course, this is a real crisis. We do need our best minds to address it. But simply put, the world is not going to end. This kind of talk in the papers, we have 12 years left, it's not helpful. It's driving down the global fertility rate. This simply isn't true. Why did we get to a place where the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fox News on the right were saying this nonsense? So the book actually looks at this, and I find there's a very predictable pattern of kind of worst-case scenarios being what gets published for us in academia. That gets amplified by the media, and by the time you get to the ordinary smart citizen population, you have things like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying, we do have 10 years left. That's an actual quote, 10 to 12 years left. So anyway, I wrote a book about that, and I encourage people to put aside all the, goddamned panicked fear that people seem to be feeling about stuff that's absolutely not going to kill you. Look back at the last 30 things that were going to kill you. None of them did. We're all still here. So at any rate, that's Confidently Wrong, which should be out in about a year. At any rate, as a staunch capitalist, I encourage you to run out and buy all of these books at Amazon.com, or even better, your local bookstore. I'll also note that at my current level of Z-list celebrity, you can also get in touch with me quite easily to tell me what you thought of this event, or book one yourself, or debate a question of politics. My name is Wilfred Reilly. It's Wilfred. Search that. You'll find my website, Twitter, my old Facebook. I went to college. For that matter, the contact at Kentucky State, if you're interested in telling me what you thought of this speech, is just wilfred.reilly@kysu.edu. So feel free to email me and give me your opinion. At any rate, with the personal speaker intro stuff out of the way, the topic of my talk the title is Which Path Forward? The two options facing the black community and America this MLK Day. And I was very clear with the panel that brought me here that although I love MLK's writings, my focus isn't going to be a modernist or postmodernist analysis of one of his texts or something like that. I'm interested in what vision forward for America makes more sense now 60 or 70 years after kind of the original civil rights movement, by which I mean the African-American civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s in the USA. And what I mean by the two paths is that there really are, outside of actual genetic hereditarianism, which I'm not going to talk much, if at all, about today, two distinct and really very well-defined explanations for what causes problems with which we're all familiar, like high rates of fatherlessness and crime within the African American community, and also now a lot more broadly, right? And the first is basically that racism, or when we get more broad, some other form of oppression does. That's the first explanation, which at most universities is about 80, 90% of what you hear. The theory is one sentence long. And this is the theory, I think, that a lot of at least casual fans associate with Dr. King, although we'll do different readings of him today. and with the civil rights movement overall. And it is still extraordinarily popular with left-wing sociologists and political scientists and historians, which is to say about 93% of them. It's kind of the thing you're supposed to say. My old internet sparring partner, Dr. Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which became part of a series that included books with titles like Anti-Racist Baby, but I'm not here to tweak the man, seems to argue that the only options that exist are, one, attributing all performance gaps between human groups to racism, and two, actually being an old school genetic racist. And he says this really openly. As I recall, page 2 and page 12, someone might correct me on the pages, not the point, but the quote is that there must either be bias in systems, however subtle and almost impossible to find, or there must be, quote, something permanently wrong with some people. As we'll see, I don't think those are the only two options, and I don't think MLK would either. But this idea is enormously appealing for obvious reasons. Robin DiAngelo and June Alexander, Rich Delgado have all expressed it in their own ways. So have a ton of feminists and queer theorists, as read Gender Gaps. Even alt-right whites often strike me as trying to work up their version to explain the dearth of conservatives on campus or non-Jewish white guys in certain fields of business or whatever. They're coming to the same thing. And like I said, at least when it comes to minorities and women, it's easy to see what the appeal is. The civil rights movement and maybe the first two waves of feminism are genuinely and kind of justifiably part of the heroic mythology of the USA by this point. Part of mainstream upper middle class America. And before we could worry about other potential issues impacting black people or poor people or women, we really did have to deal with actual repression that actually existed. Many of the horrible canards that you hear in a woke college class are actually just true. At least in the South, in the former Confederacy, the USA didn't legally desegregate until 1954. Vestiges like redlining weren't made fully illegal until the 1970s. We're going to talk about that in a second. Women didn't get the vote until 1920. Gay troops couldn't openly serve their country until Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 1995. Now, I will say that even a lot of this picture is much more complicated than it seems. So the primary factor variable that oppressed people throughout history was social class. And the great American illusion is that we don't have social classes. Talking about class is the real taboo in America. I'll take a break from the speech for 1 second and say there are only two anonymous survey questions that I find that people lie on. Like totally anonymous, blank slate survey, desks 4 feet apart, all the classics. One is, how many lovers have you had? Women still lie down, men still lie up. No pun intended, but I mean, people still lie, just obviously. The numbers, the male-female numbers are 3 and 4 apart from each other. The other is, how much money do you make? College students will sometimes claim they have $60,000 a year executive jobs. Like there's an extraordinary reluctance to tell the truth about your honest social background in the USA. And even social scientists discuss class, status, a lot less honestly than you might expect, as versus race, which is talked about constantly, sex, the 68 gender options of Tumblr, anti-Semitism, etc. So my friend John McWhorter, for example, has pointed out that 82% of the people impacted by historical redlining, at least in the past 100 years, were in fact white. If you do a basic class adjustment and then break people out by ethnicity. So i.e. black people, who were perhaps 11% of the country during this period, were greatly overrepresented. But the huge actual majority of the people in the areas classified by the major banks as lower income and dangerous were Irish, which is the other half of my ethnic background, Italian, Appalachian, Cajun, Mexican American. It went on and on. But even with that taken into account, it's perfectly understandable that decent people look at our history and say, a lot of this is pretty disgraceful. And some prejudice still exists. And given all this, as long as that's the case, I'm going to attribute all problems for minorities and most for the country overall to, what is the term, prejudice and power? And I'm going to work to eliminate that problem. And when that's done, then we can talk about other things. The problem there, though, is that we now have access to a lot of real information, empirical, quantitative knowledge, which is sort of my thing, what I try to work with, indicating that this first hypothesis simply can't really be the case. So at the most basic level, there are three kind of structural problems with it. And I was actually asked today not to bring like 50 slides full of just columns of numbers and so on. So, but in one sentence, there are a lot of problems that simply didn't exist when racism and ethnic conflict were a lot worse. Second, two, these problems don't exist at all for many black immigrants and other minority immigrants, and who report, by the way, facing the same levels of bigotry and so forth that African Americans do. As I've noted many times before, the best educated group in the country is currently Nigerian Americans. There's a whole sideline on that we could go down, but that is the group that has the most college degrees, most PhDs. The highest income group, by the way, is Indian Americans. Those of you that are on the website Twitter may have witnessed this ongoing back and forth between white guys and Indian guys who've just been ruthlessly insulting each other for several weeks. Hopefully this will stop soon, but that's one of the facts that's been brought up many times. Indian Americans make roughly $140,000 per household, as versus $50,000 to $55,000 for African Americans, maybe $80,000 for whites, for Caucasian Americans. One of the things with household information, by the way, you have to adjust for the number of people in the household. So for whites and Indians, that's about the same. For African Americans, there are fewer people in each household. There are fewer kids. You're more likely to have a single mom. So these numbers get a lot closer to each other if you just adjust for like 1.9 people is fewer than 2.6 people. So it's very easy to lie with any set of numbers. One of the classic books, How to Lie with Statistics, was updated last year. I would recommend that everyone who's still in college or grad school run out and buy it. At any rate, finally, so point one, many of these problems didn't exist in the past. Point two, they don't exist for many minority groups today. Finally, this is something I think I noticed more and more from my current resting position in Appalachia. We are starting to see almost all of the same issues in working and lower class white communities, often to the same level that we do in quote unquote the hood. I live in Kentucky right now and can personally attest to this. And the pattern of them mostly getting worse is very similar. We hit 120,000 drug overdoses 2 years ago. So current racism or even the legacy of past bias just can't really explain this at all. There's no explanatory power, 0.01. It has nothing to do with it. So what problems am I talking about? The canonical example that I am almost legally required to bring up as a right-leaning speaker is fatherlessness and family collapse. So Walter Williams, the great black, conservative, Southern, academic, quantitative, I certainly hope I got all that in the right order, writer, once pointed out that in 1938, just before World War II, the out-of-wedlock birth rate for black families was 11%. I will note that our Caucasian countrymen were doing even better. The family instability rate was 4% for that group. Today, per the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, who've started tracking divorce and fatherlessness as an epidemic, the same figures for those two populations are 36% and 69%. And I will note that this isn't concentrated among legacy Americans, what's the term, heritage Americans. It's the same problem for everybody, with, as usual, an exception for East Asian Americans. So the rate for Hispanics is 52%. The rate for Native Americans is 66%. The rate for Puerto Ricans still living on the island is 63%. I could go on down through 5 or 6 more, but it would just be equally depressing. There's really no reason to. We've seen almost a direct line with all of these tracking up from 1960 to 1970 to 1980 to 1990. This is such an almost accepted thing now that we see it discussed in pop culture. A common critique of young women among young men that I mentor or work out with is that they display what's described as fatherless behavior. I'd encourage the ladies to respond by asking whose fault that is, by the way. But the dry academic trend is real and reflected in consensus reality. And there are other patterns like this. I mean, crime also surged well after the point in time when that could easily be attributed to any kind of traditional bias. This is something that's almost forgotten, actually, that has to be discussed in any serious conversation about white flight or middle-class black flight or the effects of police defunding. Between 1963 and 1993, if you just head over to the FBI's UCR, Uniform Crime Reporting website, or to something like Disaster Center, the number of murders in the country surged from about 8,000. I'm sticking with murder here simply because they're none of the reporting issues you get with sexual assault or robbery or something like that. The number of murders surged from, I believe, 8,350 to about 25,000 as policing liberalized. And this, again, was something that was documented in pop culture. I mean, the year 1993 was, I mean, that's the year the movie New Jack City, the movie Kids, I believe. This is something that everyone who grew up in a big city remembers. They later fell back down, quote unquote, to 15,000 to 17,000 in 2015, 16, 17. But rose back over 20,000 again following the Black Lives Matter riots and protests and the COVID-19 lockdowns that I think we've all tried to wheelhouse and forget a little bit. And there are many such patterns of this kind. So at the same time, we've been noticing these things that are changing in society that don't seem to be that much linked to our historical warring with one another. Quantitative methods via Stata, SPSS, R, if you've made that tragic mistake, have been improving. And it's become increasingly obvious that there are a lot of variables, a lot of patterns that just vary among groups, even with almost all ethnic conflict removed from the picture. As I've noted before, whenever Pew and Gallup poll on this, at least the modal average age, the mean's a little closer, but the modal average age, most common age for a white male is 58. The most common average age for a black male is 27. For a Hispanic male, by the way, it's 11. So anytime you discuss something, whether that's crime rate, and those are absolutely real figures. Every time you discuss something, whether it's crime rate, wealth, these disparities among these communities, you first have to adjust for the fact that at the mean, there's a difference of more than a decade. At the mode, there's a difference of 30 years. Unless you've completely managed to screw up your life, you're going to have a great deal more money, an infinite amount more self-control at 50 than you do at 20. About 55% of African Americans, whatever, I'll deal with this later, and only 16% of Caucasians live in the South, which is the poorest, it's traditionally been the most agrarian region of the USA. Again, are you comparing the same guy when you look at the differences between these people in our country? These gaps increasingly don't benefit white Americans. So the Brookings Institute, of all places, recently looked at study time across groups, and they found that after you adjust for, I actually wrote them and looked at what they adjusted for, after you adjust for work, varsity sports, elder care, social life, and so on, African American and Hispanic kids studied, on average, typical school day, less than 40 minutes a day. White kids studied about an hour, about 59 minutes a day, and Asian kids studied 2 to 2.5 hours a day. And these gaps were directly reflected on the SAT. In fact, I will note that adjusting for study time obviates, it completely removes any need for a genetic, et cetera, IQ discussion. It's literally just how much time you spend cracking books and prepping for the test, at least among major groups, Northern Europeans, West Africans, and Asians. That's all it is. And if you look at SAT scores, I mean, in the most recent data set I have, Native kids come in at 912. I got African Americans, 949. Hispanics, 960. So there's a big block. Polynesians, I think, were about 980. Then you got whites, 1,100 or a little less. And then you have Asians way up above everyone else at around 1,250. So actually, this is something interesting for the educators. You're not just, when you're teaching, you're actually very often going to be getting 3 different blocks of students at 3 different levels of preparation. There's actually not anymore a whites and Asians category. You're going to be getting people wildly broken down. And the best way to look at this is as individuals based on how much time they've spent prepping before they get to college. And you are going to find that there's some racial and there's some by-state correlates for that. It's actually pretty fascinating. I will note, by the way, as a teacher, all of these kids were supposed to be studying 3.5 hours per day. So they asked the teachers how much homework they gave them, and the teachers said, well, 3 to 4 hours. They're supposed to be doing an hour at lunch during break. They're supposed to be doing 2 hours at home. None of them got even close. These were mostly pretty good schools, prep schools and so on. They were trying for 1300s on the SAT. I thought that was funny. That was the most underappreciated piece of the article. So almost no one actually does what they're assigned, which might be why the USA is on 28th or whatever in education. But this isn't one of my speeches focused around jokes. I just couldn't resist adding that one. A question more relevant to this speech might be, so okay, why do people and groups actually behave differently? We've gotten used to attributing this to prejudice, racism, anti-female bias. We all used to fight each other. What's the actual reason? I mean, we can throw in some obvious things like age, but what else applies? I will say first that there is a major, some might say almost frantic, attempt to still link everything that I just mentioned to sort of new kinds of racism. So this has gone on and on and on for some time. Most of you who prepped for grad school or who are academic professionals who are executives in the business world have heard some of the terms. Hidden racism. I myself have written about stereotype threat, racial resentment, new patriarchy over in feminist theory, benevolent sexism, when you don't think you're a bigot and your partner likes this, but you still are. I don't necessarily think most people still buy this. At root, it's fairly hard to say. I mean, let the debate continue. But at root, it's pretty hard to say that something like experiencing racism differently is the reason that Asians and West Africans beat white people by 100 points on some test. So I don't know how long that argument is going to continue. Again, what is the actual answer? At the group level, the answer is probably a lot of things, which Dr. King discussed, and which my paradigm in the social sciences, going back to William Julius Wilson, Thomas Sowell, a bunch of other people, Amy Chua, might lump together as culture or culture and social systems. There's a very important point here. There's no reason to expect everybody to be the same. This is actually something you pointed out at lunch today. The conversation was had about this. There's no reason to expect people who study at an individual level or a group level for 2.5 hours a day to do only as well in school as people who study for 40 minutes a day. Or to expect people who currently excel in athletics to study exactly as much as people who currently don't. Now, again, I think most of those gaps can be made up pretty quickly, certainly among individuals, often among groups. But in any particular time, in any particular society, people do different things for a whole range of reasons. In fact, there's no reason at all to think that all groups of people would ever perform at the exact same level if there was no prejudice at all. Although this is currently a guiding principle of American law and social science. People are different for all kinds of different reasons. Cultural, I would assume that in any given society, the majority of the chefs in French restaurants would be rich. Historical, and luck, stochastic would be a fancy way of putting this, but where did your group end up settling in a landmass the size of the USA? And you could go through 5 or 6 others. I've mentioned a few cultural variables just now with athletic participation, raw study time itself, trust in systems, which goes back to past conflict but isn't the same thing. A systemic variable that has some influence here, it's not really cultural, is welfare policy. This is something that predicts fatherlessness around the world. So this is mentioned oddly rarely, possibly because of the racially charged nature of the US debate, but the illegitimacy rate, or fatherlessness rate if you prefer, in Norway right now is 61.2%. And that tracks directly to the start of modern social democratic policy. It used to be 8%, at least according to AI Online, which might or might not be true. It used to be a lot lower. I don't know. Coming from the law, like, I have very little trust in any of those models. But anyway, at the most basic level, if you get pregnant in a relationship with a young man you don't much like, why? And this is actually a quote from Lisa Yarvin, the online feminist writer. Why negotiate sex and domestic labor with that fool if the state will pay you to not work and raise the kid with your own name? There are many issues with that down the road, but 22-year-old quarreling couples aren't necessarily known for thinking down the road. Similarly, the U.S. rises in fatherless families track to the Great Society. I think that's pretty undisputed. And at the individual level, so we did a few cultural ones, we did a societal or a systemic variable, but at the individual level, an almost forgotten factor that predicts how people do at close to 0.9 is personal agency, how you choose to act, what you decide to do. Coaches and priests and rabbis have long irritated tie-wearing social scientists by pointing out that people who follow the moronically simple 4-part success sequence, take any job, don't have a kid until you're married or 25 years old. A lot of people add never get convicted of a felony and finish high school are about 99% likely never to be poor. This is absolutely true, by the way. It's about 99.3%. You will never experience poverty if you do those 4 things. The interesting thing about this is I recall Ian Rowe's research, and someone might correct me with an additional variable during question time, but not much other than drive and maybe IQ predicts who will follow it. I've always found that fascinating. So we really do have some level of free will. There's a very simple way to be reasonably successful, to be middle class in life. A lot of people manage to do it. A lot of people don't manage to do it. What predicts whether you manage to do it? Whether you have the baraka to manage to do it. That's basically it. It might even be the case that some people are good and other people are bad. Now, this isn't really a social scientific conclusion, but when we start thinking like this again, we notice that very simple old school policies often work. In El Salvador, our neighbor to the south, the leader Nayib Bukele, who I will concede is not perfect on civil rights, but recently managed to drop murder in his nation, which used to be the global murder capital, from 108 murders per 100,000 people per year to 1 murder per 100,000 people per year. How did he manage to do this? Well, he targeted people who were obvious criminals. How did he identify people who were obvious criminals? If you're familiar with South Central American gang structure, they had face tattoos that said, "I am an obvious criminal." So someone would have the number 13 tattooed on their face and then a representative tattoo for each major crime. And what Bukele said was that if you were involved in any crime and then you had a tattoo that said something like, "I am a rapist murderer," he was going to take you and lock you in prison on a mountainside somewhere. And via this simple mechanism, he was able to reduce crime from this, what is our murder rate currently? 5 per 100,000, that's considered very high. From 20x the US murder rate to nothing. I applaud this. I think that's a very effective way of dealing with crime in the streets. Taking people who publicly announce they're criminals and throwing them in prison. And I think that something like this with a bit more consideration for the old Constitution would very likely work here. If you look at the BJS and CVS, the annual Bureau of Justice Statistics collection of crime data, one of the things that's remarkably interesting is how few people actually commit crimes. There's an endless discussion about how are the African American rates higher than the Caucasian rates in a typical year. They usually are. How are Hispanics assimilating to the USA? Is that rate still high? But something else that's worth noting is that 98.7% of black men and 99.3% of white men don't commit any crimes over a 2-year period. Almost 100%, it was 99.6% plus of more oppressed women, when I last looked, don't commit any crimes over at least that period. Good job, ladies. Interestingly, by the way, women commit almost no crime. If you were going to make a serious feminist point, one of the interesting points about the BJS is that every year something like 85% of the criminals are men. If you break out the serious violent criminal stats, it's just pretty much exclusively guys. It always surprises me that this is just never brought up during the endless gender warring in our current society. But at any rate, it strikes me that a logical policy would be to solve crime, target criminals. This basic breakdown is even more extreme in our cities, by the way. I dislike exaggerating during speeches, and I forget this city. But in one of the 10 largest cities in the USA recently, the Times announced a couple of weeks back that there were 331 people that were responsible for 2/3 of the crime in the town. It may have been a specific crime such as theft, but that was definitely the headline. So, I mean, you could literally, in many places, adopt a 10 strikes and you're out policy and cut crime by half. So, I could reduce this last page to a sentence. We can fix most problems in black communities, Appalachian communities, and other American communities by identifying the people that are doing things well, the people that are doing things badly, treating both groups appropriately, and treating people overall as individuals, as members of groups other than their races, and based on the content of their character. Returning to that would be my suggestion of how best to honor the great Dr. King. Thank you.
Well, thank you for an enlivening and lively presentation. We have a microphone set up for questions. Over in the back to your right, it's from the stage to the left. So please, if you have a question, we welcome you to ask it to our speaker. And if you have a speech, we would rather you not give it. So
Check.
Please come forward.
Check.
I love these technical difficulties. Okay.
Anyone?
Well, as the queue assembles, let me take the moderator's privilege and throw out a question. One of the interesting phenomena, and you mentioned crime rates, one of the interesting phenomena of the 1990s is how crime dropped over the decade. And you'd mentioned New Jack City and these cultural artifacts. There was a point where George H.W. Bush gave an Oval Office address about the crack epidemic. And many leading civil rights civil rights activists, including Jesse Jackson, had urged tough penalties against violent crime as a way to make neighborhoods safer. And I wonder how the fall off of crime had shaped race relations and made tensions after the 90s much lower.
Yeah, you guys can all hear me, correct? Okay, I think that, first of all, I think that crime dropped during this era because we started enforcing the law. And that's something that isn't really discussed as often as it should be. I mean, so when I talk about that peak of 25,000 murders that we reached, we never got back to 1950s, 1960s levels. But again, by 2010, before the BLM movement, before the left and the right both returned to kind of their aggressive bases, we'd gone back to, say, 14,000 murders with a larger population. The 1994 crime bill, I mean, remember, was endorsed by the Congressional Black Caucus. It was supported very heavily by the bases of both political parties. So when you look at everything from broken windows policing to, you know, George Bush posing with that bag of crack on television like Captain Kangaroo, kind of illustrating what this was in the cities, you had a major consensus on crime among the line Jesse Jackson used at one point was the black and the white Rotary Club, most taxpayers, right? And as a result, race relations, something a lot of 90s kids thought and that we didn't imagine was that race relations were extremely good. There might be a fist fight across color lines or something, but I mean, when I went to high school at East Aurora Senior in 1995 to 1999, I mean, my group of friends included African-American guys, Italian guys, Irish guys, Mexican guys. There was that sort of locker room teasing, but race was quite seriously not a major focus. Probably 40 to 50% of the relationships were interracial, technically speaking, and that doesn't count like Italian, Irish, white, Hispanic. I mean, it was not something that people focused on constantly. The enormous amount of postmodern stuff that I see in the schools for my friends' kids is very bizarre. Even the extremes of feminism sometimes approach this, like the questions about is it okay to ask someone out in this fashion for prom? Is this age gap too large? People seem to be taking the sort of Marxist analysis that you'd use figuring out power dynamics between your union and the ownership of a plant and trying to apply that to day-to-day life, and it doesn't seem to be working. But at any rate, moving on from that, race relations are fairly good. You can actually measure this. I mean, Pew measures them every year, right? And so in 1999, in that kind of Jordan Bird era, I guess Bird had retired by that point, but 70% of white adults and 66% of black adults rated race relations very good. The last time I looked, 2021 or something, just good was at 35% among whites, 33% among African Americans. So we've seen, you can call some of this justified, maybe people in the past were living in a bit of a purple haze, but we've seen a dramatic drop-off. And there's something to be said almost, not for propaganda, but for the promotion of positive knowledge among countrymen. You know, if most people thought their lives were pretty good, and mass media encouraged men, women, whites, and African Americans, so on, to mostly like each other, you put the positive story on the front page, so I think that's a good thing. So, but anyway, the core of all that was that we fought crime, and I think that worked.
So places that were seen as dangerous and scary, Fort Apache, the Bronx, or parts of Chicago, suddenly you can go there.
Yeah, and it's astonishing how much that was the case. I mean, you know, I'm from Chicago, and even in Chicago, we thought of parts of New York as burnout wastelands. I mean, so like the rapper Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, was from, I think he was from Bushwick in Brooklyn. And there are these videos that I remember having as a young man where he was standing on this street corner next to a burning car, freestyle rapping like, I call you son because you're mine, not because you shine. And I remember thinking, wow, that looks like a very unpleasant place. And, you know, today Bushwick is a complete hipster neighborhood, and kombucha shops across the street from, you know, Ghanaian-owned West African restaurants and so on. So I think that became possible because of the extraordinary decline in crime. And hopefully that doesn't reverse.
Question?
Yes, so one of the things I was wondering is, does the, I guess, quote unquote, wasn't even sure if it was your exact words, but single motherhood rate, does that include, or does it view differently, you know, fathers that are completely out of the picture, and then, say, shared custody?
That's a good question. Single motherhood is generally measured annually, and that would generally be fathers who are not on the birth, like you're not on the birth certificate. You're not present at that time. Like you're not, divorce is generally viewed as different from single fatherhood at conception and birth. As I understand, that's the CDC scaling for single fatherhood. So, I mean, I think you'd have to, That's a good question, but I think the answer is actually very depressing, right? You'd probably have to look at single fatherhood plus divorce on an annual basis. I could be wrong. I'm going to check that. I'm going to look that up after the event, but I'm about 85% sure you'd have to combine those.
Okay.
But the horrible answer also is the divorce rate's 39%.
Well, that's an interesting point, that it would be, as a statistical question, it would be interesting to date some of these issues from no-fault divorce. I forget what year that came, but is there a pattern in both the black, white, and other communities that would date from that period? I mean,
Well, I think the young scholar's question also is an interesting one because some of these things aren't necessarily all bad. You don't want people to have to live with their alcoholic, wife-beating husband, right? But the problem is that was never the majority situation. Like, I wouldn't get rid of no-fault divorce, but if you actually look at the reasons for divorce, like the most common reason given is difficult to reconcile personal differences. And whenever I've broken into that category as like a young legal guy, it was like he and her both use pornography. I don't mean to be glib or crude about this, but it was things that I think most couples in the past probably would have managed to deal with. We now have an almost infinite number of outs. They're dating apps that will send the other sex to your house. So it's much, much easier to just leave that relationship.
questions?
Hi, this is a very big change in topic, but so you said that one of the possible ways to kind of better this issue would be to identify the good people and identify the bad people. How would you expect that to play out in our society, and kind of what would that look like for the U.S. if that were to occur when we talk about race?
That's an interesting question. I mean, how do you... Okay, so I've a couple solid questions in a row. I'm going to dance around and avoid it. No, but I think that the idea that good and bad exist is something that people have been very reluctant to admit for a while. And like I said, my background was in law. Then I moved to political science. And we don't use those terms at all. And you see the effects of this in practice. So there was a recent legal case that I was following in Chicago where a guy who had 56 previous criminal arrests hit someone with a pipe and I think blinded her. And he was recently released. He got probation. He didn't go to jail this time either. So when you ask how would you identify a bad person, I would say one way you could do that would be multiple previous felony charges. Another way you could do that would be psychological tests that indicate you are evil. But how do you define evil? You enjoy violent pedophilia. Like, I think that there are... Medicalization of human nature doesn't necessarily change it. I think is an important point that we're probably going to turn back to at some point. So if I have had this isn't me personally, but if I have had 26 romantic partners and if I have cheated on all 26 of my romantic partners, leading to screaming, mutually violent breakups, and someone tells me, you're a complete dog who can't be trusted, and I say, no, I'm not. I have complete dog who can't be trusted syndrome. I'm not sure that I have resolved or changed the problem. So I guess if I were defining a bad person, I would really turn back to any of the traditional vices and the Stoic philosophy I prefer, the Christian tradition or whatnot, and say uncontrolled wrath, which would be represented in most crimes, extreme sexual perversion, kids, anything of that sort. Like you'd probably, if you're so addicted to your drug of choice that you're committing crimes of theft, something like that. So there'd probably be, say, 10 or 15% of society, as there always has been, that you could put in that category, uncontrollable and dangerous to others. And I don't really know how that would break down along racial or regional lines if you're counting it broadly. I mean, like white-collar crime would certainly count. I don't think race would play a major role. But again, if it does, who cares? Like the category of people you'd be targeting would be the people who are doing bad things. And I guess one final point there, if Bukele, so I'm not going to take credit for Bukele's comment and get criticized for it, but I mean, one point that Naib said on some podcast is you know, all racial and class differences in crime would disappear if you killed all the criminals. Now, that probably wouldn't be my solution yet, but, you know, there's an element of truth to that. Let's say jailed instead. We talk constantly about racial differences in certain forms of offending, robbery and so on. I would note, by the way, that if you adjust for age and class, quite a few of these simply vanish. But if most people who had committed, say, 3 serious crimes were actually in jail and were there for a long time and were monitored in a proper program when they got out, those differences wouldn't exist in the first place. So my focus would be keeping an eye on people who genuinely do bad things so they can't hurt good people. But yeah, bad people are people who, bad people, I'm finally answering your question as opposed to rambling in this legalistic fashion. Bad people are people who repeatedly and frequently do bad things to good people. I'm not sure there's another definition.
Well, part of the problem seems to be excusing it. And I think you hit that nail on the head quite well, that you have bad person syndrome. And so that becomes an excuse.
Well, yeah, I think this is something that we've done for a long time. Again, some of the things I'm saying might be controversial, or people might think I'm glib or even joking, but this comes up a lot with the death penalty and with similar punishments in large urban courts, right? Where people will say things like, this is a common argument among skilled big city lawyers. Well, you can't put my client in jail. My client has an IQ of 78, and he's not fully aware of what he's done. And to me, that's not really a defense. Like, you're saying, well, your client is a repeat rapist, but not only that, he is too dumb, bluntly, to understand why it's bad to be a repeat rapist. That might affect my willingness to kill the guy, but you've got to remove that person from society permanently. You can't just say, well, so we're going to let him go to hurt more people because he's less functional than any normal person. That's not an argument that any rational person would accept. This person is in a critical way less, I don't know another word, than most functional taxpayers, and so we've got to give him a privilege that no functional taxpayer has. I don't think that's acceptable.
Question.
Thank you. So class seems to play an important role in groups, and certain groups also seem to play an important role. So for example, I'm a student at ASU, I'm a student at SCETL. For identifying ourselves and building up ourselves. What we also see in politics, though, is we see these groups as demographics used, you know, the African vote, the evangelical vote, groups like that.
Yeah.
How do we're talking about like ethically grouping people without getting into a lot of these oversimplifications that have negative effects. How do we find that distinction where we're still recognizing groups and working with them properly and within politics, but we aren't kind of taking it too far on the class level?
That's a good question. I think that one appropriate point might just be stopping at the boundaries of reality. So one of my objections with race in the debate about racism and privilege and so on is that it's become conventional to claim that every disparity between groups is due to race or race bias. The problem with that is just that it's factually false. You can simply demonstrate that it's factually false. I mean, if you are arguing that in the context of, say, academic performance, you can simply expand the debate beyond blacks and whites and look at whether Caucasian Hispanics are outperforming African Americans or whites are outperforming Asians. I mean, if you're looking in the context of political voting patterns and you're saying, well, we see this vote among people of African descent, I don't see a problem with that at all. One thing you should probably still do, though, is adjust for other relevant metrics that might play a role there. That's something that comes to mind. I mean, if you look at the major Protestant churches in the South, and you're focused on people of the working class who attend those institutions and so on, do you still see a coefficient that means anything for black? And I mean, I don't know. I would assume you do. Like, I would assume you see a very loyal black Democratic Party voter for a lot of reasons. But in my own research on crime and so on, I actually often don't. That's one of the things that I found pretty interesting when I started looking at, is there a lot of truly unique behavior in the black community? I mean, when I started noticing the extreme age differences, regional differences, like if you compare black and white males of the same region, the same basic test score performance, same age, and so on down the line, do you see a lot of differences in lifestyle behavior? The answer is actually no. I mean, the question is just how many of those guys are there? So, I mean, I guess I would say make proper adjustments, and if you still see enduring racial differences, then you found an actual and interesting effective race. One of the things that I think I criticize the academics on the political left for is claiming giant residuals when they haven't adjusted for anything. Would be a mathematical way of putting it. Just sort of saying, well, if I can ask, did you see the recent study about how black babies were more likely to die if they had a white doctor? I see a couple gentlemen nodding here. Yeah, there was a recent project that looked at, a recent project claimed that I guess all infants are young. A recent project claimed that African American infants were more likely to die if they were cared for by a white physician. They didn't adjust for a whole lot of other things like the health behavior of the mother or the risk factors inherent in the baby, like birth weight. And a lot of people speculated, well, if you adjusted for those things, you'd find there's no difference at all, or the white doctors did a little better. And the authors of the paper basically said, well, no, we don't think that's true. And 6 months later, some people got a hold of the data, and they found out, yeah, that's true. So, I mean, you see a great deal of that, where like a raw difference is found, and it is attributed to either A, race, or B, racism. I guess what I would say is don't do that. If you find that something survives like the normal scientific method, yeah, you found an actual difference that's attributable to race. And I don't see any difference in saying, any problem with saying, well, those are race differences. There are race differences. I mean, like, other than that, I don't know if I have any useful advice.
Very engaging talk, thank you. There were two things that you said that I was hoping you could riff on a little bit, because I think they were related, albeit they were not directly so in your remarks. Your first was the statement that the real kind of cleavage in America is increasingly class rather than race. And then that you shared with us some of the really fascinating SAT score data. And in recent years, we've sort of seen standardized tests demonized for, I suspect you would share my view, very spurious reasons. And in fact, the effect of that has been, actually to depress social mobility. But standardized tests seem to be making a comeback. And I was just wondering if you would reflect on these two things and whether we might dare to hope that standardized tests are back and may continue to be sort of engines for mobility that they have historically been.
Yeah, I don't think, this isn't something I've extensively researched, but yeah, I would say it's increasingly obvious if you look at anything from the big sort on, that class is more of a social cleavage than race today. I mean, when I think even where I live in a pretty egalitarian state in Kentucky, if you go to a standard Louisville suburb in a sort of HOA area, yeah, you would see a pretty diverse group of people, East Indians, African American, dentists and doctors, whites, I mean, Eastern European, successful children of refugees. You would see very few, if any, poor people. So yes, I think that's a pattern that most of us in this room have probably gotten used to seeing. So that's definitely something. And I think actually what we're seeing right now is the growth of the curated world. Something that I ask my students at the start of every semester is, are you a Democrat or a Republican? And in Kentucky, it's actually fairly mixed. Okay, well, how many people of the other party do you follow? Are you a feminist? Okay, well, how many, I wouldn't ask like men's rights activists, but how many athletes for this university do you follow that are male? And even over 10 years, you've seen the number of people on the other team dramatically decrease. You might follow a Republican if it's your brother, but you wouldn't follow Rand Paul, for example, the witty conservative senator from your own state. So that's part of it. You can now take just the 20 feminist liberal accounts that are suggested to you by the sidewall of Twitter or Instagram, And you're doing that while you're living in a neighborhood that is pretty racially diverse, but where almost everyone's from your same social class. You're going to prep school rather than public school, so on down the line. So yeah, I think those cleavages are more important to most people than race. And I mean, that's why you'll see, like, if you actually look at any of the BLM events, I assume Louisville, Minneapolis, Chicago are pretty representative of the Midwest, if not the country. I mean, it's a group of people that are very racially diverse, but mostly like working middle through upper middle class. They're dressed very similarly. They're wearing the same shirts. They even have similar looking weapons. I mean, so that is mostly what I see, and I don't think that's an unusual experience. Standardized tests are an interesting thing because, yes, every single study that's been done on the SAT and similar exams finds that those are the tools that best facilitate social mobility. And that's not really surprising because, I mean, obviously there's a slight correlation between class and IQ. Like, you are more likely to be very smart if you're rich. Obviously, you have a chance of making money if you're smart. But at the same time, I mean, librarians and other people who don't make an extraordinary amount of annual income are pretty high IQ. So, I mean, when I grew up in a working class environment, my mother was a teacher. I took the SAT and it wasn't an incredible score, but I got a 1360 the first time. Started getting college offers, later did better. So that you frequently see that people will just leave working class, certainly middle class environments based on those test scores. Other selection mechanisms for a college, even as good as Illinois, much less Yale, are going to be much more class targeted. I mean, if you're writing an essay about the great summer you had on a cowboy ranch, you're probably not coming from a working class background. I also think there is some subtle second level awareness of that on the part of upper middle class parents. So, I mean, when people say, I think standardized tests are prejudiced against poor kids, and they themselves are an upper class mother, are they really unaware of the fact that knowing how to use AI to help your kid prepare their statement is not an evenly distributed skill? I don't always think so. The last thing, but there's some fascinating writing on empathy, actually. Like, the ability to seem empathic and to convince other people you care about them is actually a trait that's really disproportionately distributed among sociopaths. So if someone is acting like they care about you all the time and constantly pitching what they want in terms of other people and the most helpless people, you need to watch your back around them. Like, I and most other people will kind of just say, like, as long as it's not dishonorable, I'm going to do the thing that's going to benefit me the most, like, stop me if you can. And that's actually much more healthy. That's the basis of sport, that's the basis of war, that's the basis of business. So, I mean, I think a lot of people know exactly what they want, and they're just using these sort of weasel words to present it as something other than what it is. Are we making a turn back to standardized tests? I think so. I mean, if you look at the UC system, the Ivy League, the Big Ten, all that noise about we don't need to use them lasted about a year. If you talk behind the scenes with some of the people in the Big Ten, which I don't have the same contacts in the Ivies, but I mean, what they basically said is we got a lot of idiot rich kids the first year. We didn't even, the minority percentages increased 1%. We can't keep doing this. It was great for our Greek system, you know, but it wasn't what we expected it to be. So I think that was a short-term experiment.
Thank you very much for your talk and for your comments.
Thank
I'd like
you.
to quickly revisit the, I think, important question the student asked earlier, and bring MLK in, and ask about this classification of people into good and bad, and how MLK's understanding of soul force in Christian philosophy might push back against such categorizations, because those categorizations, according to a lot of MLK's work, are what led to black men being called bad for so long and white men being called good.
Well, I mean, I'd have to refresh. So that's a very good question. I'd honestly have to refresh my reading of every one of MLK's essays dealing with the concept of soul force. I don't mean that as a glib repost because I came here to talk about MLK. I think that a simple first stage response would be that obviously any categorization that would come to the conclusion that all or most black men were bad and all or most white men were good would simply be wrong. So I think that in general, that would be one element of the response there. The basic conclusion that some people are good and some people were bad, obviously we're not going to base our criminal law on what I said here, although it might be better than what we have now in some areas. But I do think that that's something that we do need to return to, not as a flat standard, but there are a lot of behaviors. I mean, the 57 attacks on elderly women is an extreme example, but there are a lot of behaviors. Like, I would say most sexual violence falls in this category. There's no financial gain from that. That's, as I may assume many of you know, certainly many of the female attendees, that's one of the most common categories of crime. Repeated predatory theft for money. There's a great deal of behavior that is very soul reflective that we've gotten kind of used to simply dismissing as the result perhaps of miscalculation, a bad day, something like that. I think it probably is the case that there'd be a very high correlation between being a predatory robber and being unable to follow the success sequence. There are other things that are probably pretty predictive of moral character. A repeated failure to pass after age 10 the marshmallow test, something like that. So I think that we do need to refine these ideas, but I do think there are almost certainly good people and bad people. And I think everyone in practice agrees with that. Have you ever seen, this is a silly question, but do any of you know the name of the football wide receiver that was involved in that recent scandal? Used to be on the Vikings. Diggs. Yes, okay. Have any of you seen the video of someone going around the Vikings locker room asking people if they would let their sister date the wide receiver Stephon Diggs? Okay, I see a couple gentlemen nodding in the back. So this is the last thing I'm going to say because, frankly, I didn't answer the first part of your question. It's a good question. I need to do a little more reading. But this is a good illustration of what I mean by what people are discussing when they say a bad person. There's a football player, an American football player, used to be a receiver for the Vikings, named Stephon Diggs. One of the guys on the team, I think a backup quarterback, went around the Vikings locker room and asked the entire team, who on this team would you not let date your sister? Who do you think's the biggest dog, the least trustworthy guy? And everyone on the team said the name Stephon Diggs. And he asked the guys why, and they all gave these detailed descriptions, like, because he's crazy, doesn't keep his word, nope, he's just not the type of guy you bring home, I'm not even going to tell you, but I know. And this same person recently was involved in something like 3 back-to-back scandals, one of which I won't even discuss in front of this audience, another of which involved him getting his personal chef pregnant, and just so on down the line. And I think that we've recently become extremely tolerant of this sort of thing. Caddishness is no longer a crime or a sin. I say bring it back. Stephon Diggs, bad person. But thank you for your question, sir.
I think we have 2 more questions.
Thank you for your talk. And please correct me if I misrepresent something that I thought I understood you to say. I thought I heard you suggest that rates of crime committed by whites and blacks may be similar. I'm saying if that's the case, how do we explain the vast disparity of rates of incarceration between blacks and whites? Does that suggest that our judicial system is racially biased?
Well, I can answer that pretty simply, actually. So this is actually my core area of expertise as it happens. So there are 2 major national crime databases. There's the FBI UCR, Uniform Crime Reporting Database, and the Department of Justice BJS NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Statistics Database. If you use the NCVS, what I do is the Index Violent Crime database, basically, the annual violent crime reporting statistics. In a typical year, there are about 2.4 times as many, proportionately, African American as white violent crimes. Now, overall, there are about twice as many violent crimes committed by whites, but there are 5 times as many Caucasians in the United States. This is all just pretty basic math. So, typical black guy, about 2.4x as likely to commit a violent offense as a typical white guy. Now, again, you have to do the basic adjustments here. What you'd actually be comparing is a black guy and a white guy of, same age, same region, so on down the line. That closes the gap very substantially. But your question, I think, is generally a critique of you're coming kind of from the left, probably. The normal, dissident attack on this would be from the right. No, I don't think the justice system is particularly biased. I think you'd have to look at a number of things when you look at who's going to be in jail. One would be just lawyer quality. So you're looking at, do black and white defendants in general, before you adjust for education, before you adjust for test scores, so on down the line, region, again, have the same access to money and the same quality of counsel? For that matter, do you have the same quality of counsel in Mississippi as a white guy? So, I mean, again, if you take that into account, a substantial amount of that disappears. Also, I mean, you have to look at past record. So if you have 2.4x year over year over year, you're going to get more black guys that are in jail for longer periods of time. You also have different crimes committed by each cohort. So again, I would go a lot harder on crimes against women and crimes in the home. But the most common crime committed by African Americans, well, the most common serious violent felony committed by African Americans disproportionately is murder. So in the USA, unbelievably, 53% of the murders are committed by black defendants. Now, there are a lot of very disproportionate white crimes, too, violent attacks on kids and so on, but murder carries a very long sentence. In fact, the crime for which the most white and black defendants are incarcerated in federal and probably in state prison is murder. The whole idea that there are a large number of guys sitting in prison currently because they had a bag of something that wasn't pled down, that was just the charge, is wildly inaccurate and has been since the 80s. So no, I'd have to run a couple of models, but I don't think there's substantial prejudice in the system when you adjust for the kind of crimes that people are charged with, when you adjust for quality of counsel, when you adjust for previous criminal records, so on. Is there some? Quite possibly. I mean, no one denies that some racism exists. And I also, the last thing for me, but I think that's an important point, by the way. No one really denies that some racism exists. I think that this kind of gets lost in the mix. I don't think you'd find much with those adjustments made. The question is, again, what's the residual? Like, when you take everything else into account, you're not going to find that an 80% gap between black and white citizens is caused by racial prejudice. So the problem is that very often people will simply point to that gap and say, aha!
Our final question.
Last one. No pressure.
Just as a quick preface, very few folks in here might have known, even you cited the study about the doctors and the different health outcomes, but strikingly, the Supreme Court justices dissenting in the Harvard case did cite that approvingly. But my question is, you've kind of identified a few things that you think people have sort of failed to appreciate. So when you're arguing with people, do you find that the biggest issue is innumeracy, that they're not thinking through the appropriate controls? Is it a lack of sort of historical perspective where they think the world began in 1968 or 2020? Is it a lack of sort of constitutional or legal thinking? Just when you're arguing with people, what do you find that you most urgently need to convey to most of them?
Well, I think you got the first two pretty well. I think a lack of historical perspective of those two is probably the biggest. Because it's not even that people think the world began in 1968, it's that people have no idea what human life was like for most of history. When I mentioned some of the atrocities, and they were atrocities by our standards, that existed in the USA historically, even more than gay men not being allowed to serve their country, marital rape was technically legal in many states till 1993. And I will note for the fellas, men were actually called up for the military war draft until 1973. You did a 4-year term. You were very likely to get shot. I mean, Vietnam was the last country we fought in. I mean, all of this went on. Whenever people bring this up and they say, how could you defend a country like this? The context is that was every country for all of time. I mean, and I think a lot of people don't understand this. Slavery in Mauritania, for example, ended in 2007. This is from my book, Lies. I'm not going to promote the full title and ISBN again. But slave was one of the first 12 written human words. That's not an exaggeration. Writing was initially used to keep track of the king's lands and property. So there was no beautiful poetic purpose for at least 2,000 years until people started writing love poetry. So you had a word for sheep. How many sheep did His Majesty or Her Majesty have? Cattle. And then you'd have captured warriors. The actual Sumerian glyph for slave meant captured warrior. It was the word for man from the mountains, which was something like this, but with something that looked suspiciously like a shackle wrapped around these. So that's what a slave was. A slave was a broken enemy. And from that point forward, the Romans, the Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, all of these people, and you know this, I'm just sort of speaking to the audience, but had tons of slaves. So the reality of history was the reality of warfare. Most societies were quite oppressive to women. Most societies were quite oppressive to men below the highest class. Most societies had a designated war season. After you'd planted everything, you'd go fight the neighbors for 4 or 5 months. You'd march to the next city, try to kill them. You normally wouldn't get it done. You'd march back. You'd sing the praises of the men you'd lost. I mean, this was what life was. Humans were one of many predator species on the planet. And I think people are completely unaware of all of that. But I don't have no training in medicine. When did pasteurization, effective warfare against disease, come to be? 1736?
19th century.
19th
century, 1800s.
Well, thank you. Yeah, before that, if you got sick, you got the strong form of influenza, something like that, you died. You fought well and won, or you died. I mean, so I think that unawareness of this is one of the bigger problems in society. People have no idea of what came before us, what life used to be like. Even a simple phrase, I'm kind of going on here, so I'll end with this. When people look at metaphors throughout history, like wolf at the door, working like a slave, my Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, best set of 2, those didn't start as metaphors. They were just descriptions. There were wolves at the door in the winter because they were hungry. So, I mean, that's what life was like. And I've never really been to the third world. I mean, I spent time in Latin America after high school and so on. But I mean, you still see things like this. It's very hard to be an oversensitive liberal if you've seen a tapeworm and helped a friend deal with it. So it's just, that is what all existence was, and most of it still is. I think people don't know that. Innumeracy is, this is going to be an anticlimax, but innumeracy is kind of a close second. I mean, I'll often say things like, did you adjust for age? And people will be like, did I what for what? So, I mean, that kind of comes up. Yeah, so, great question.
Well, thank you for coming out for this Martin Luther King commemoration. And we hope you will come to future SCETL events and follow us online. And Wilfred, thank you for a fine
Thank you for having me.